we said it.
Yeah, that he holds that, Roger Penrose holds that it's not that we live in a world and then we have consciousness, but rather from consciousness stems all of reality. It's like an outflowing of consciousness, and then there are higher and lower levels of awareness.
Isn't that very Kabbalistic?
It's very interesting. Yeah, I think it's very. It sounds to me very Jewish.
Yeah.
The whole concept of quantum mechanics, of course, is. I mean, I don't know too much about it, but I do know that there was that whole thing a couple of years ago. They did that experiment, and they proved at least one part of Einstein wrong, which is a big deal because almost everything we have in the modern world comes from Einstein in a certain sense, of all our microwaves and cable TV and all that. Yes, I think so. Yeah. So I'm told. But they did an experiment where it proved that the fastest speed is actually instantaneous. Instant is actually the fastest, as opposed to the speed of light. And it's a whole interesting experiment. You can look it up. How did we get on that topic? All right. So this may seem a little strange, but we're going to skip around a little bit. It's just actually I realize part of the point of this teaching, and we're going to learn Parshas Lech Lecha, even though it's Elul. It's one of my favorite parshiot. Anyway, in the Midrash and Elam, there's no teaching on the current parsha, so it's one of my favorites. So I figured we'd learn it. To say this little prayer here before we learn. Tonight, I was saying that Kedah B'Shtachvei B'Kever Tanu B'Toachcha Amad B'Techa Avodat Kodesh Nasat Lan Chelik Nesodas V'Asach HaKadosh Amanu Umecha Inu Asher Asis Imanu Chesed Gedol Kazeh Alkin Nachnu Mapim B'Tachnu V'Necha Shtimko V'Tislach V'Folcha V'Seinu V'Avnaseinu V'Alyu V'Avnaseinu V'Avdinu B'Neinu V'Necha V'Chinu Yitzon V'Necha V'Mai Elohim V'Eloseinu Konen Es L'Veinu L'Yoskel V'Al V'Sach V'Takshi V'Necha V'Dvarinu Eile ותפתח ולבינו הער בסודוס כועסת ויהיה למדינו זה נחס ואופק נחיסת ודך לקריח מכוח תעצי אלינו אור מקור נשמסינו בכל פינסינו ושסנוס ניצוצוס עבדת הקדושים אשר על ידם גליסה דברך האלה בעולם וחוס אבסם וחוס כועסם ושנים סם ושסם ימוד לנו ובאלנו קשר בדברים אלו וחוסם תאיר עינינו במה שאנו לומדים כמאמר עיניים בנות ישראל גל עיני והביטה נפלאות מכועסת כי השם ייתן חוכמה מפיו דעת וסגונה ורצוני מפיו והגיון מפניך נצור וכל הבריאות. It's interesting, there's an interesting, this is prayer, so interesting, every week kind of come across something new. The Takshiv Aznach L'Dvarenu Eila, and part of the prayer is, and please God, you should listen to our words. Like it should, God should listen, like meaning, it's a very interesting thing. We talk a lot in our lives, but it's an amazing thing to think, so to speak, that God is listening. That our words should be so important that actually God hears them. They reverberate, throughout the universe. Okay, that's time. My name is Daniel, and I'm a coffee addict. I've been an addict for quite a while now. I'm only on the. I'm trying to cut down. I'm down to like 2 cups, so this is my second cup. So I'll occasionally be drinking. It's coffee. So okay. So Lech Lecha. V'yomer Hashem el Avram Lech Lecha me'artzecha mimoladetcha mibeis avicha. El Arz Asher Ar'eka. God says to Avram, go to you, or you should go. It's a very interesting phrase, Lech Lecha. Go to you from your land, and from the place you were born, and from the house of your father, to the land which I will show you. Okay, lots of interesting things. Rashi, Lech Lecha laha natcha u'latovat techa. Right, for your benefit and for your good. Now it's actually interesting. how Rashi actually relates again. The regular Rashi actually relates quite interestingly to the Zohar, which is really fascinating. I hope we'll get there. Let's see here. Lech Lecha. Rabbi Yehuda Patach, Hanitzanim niru ba'aretz, eit hazamur higia, v'kol hator nishma be'artzenu. The budding is from Shir Hashirim. So first of all, it's interesting that Rabbi Yehuda in the Zohar, in interpreting Lech Lecha, quotes Shir Hashirim. Really, it's interesting. It doesn't seem like what. It's interesting. So Hanitzanim, I think Rashi says again. I'm not quite as well prepared as him. It's a little earlier, but it's over there. So that's fine. It's like these little budding things. Hanitzanim niru ba'aretz. So it's like these little budding plants and everything are kind of sprouting. The time of singing, really, not the time of pruning, right? So the time of singing has come. Meaning, again, I think as Rashi says, the birds are singing. The kol hator nishma ba'artzenu. Really, kol hator. Tor is not only turtle but turtle dove, type of bird. Nishma like related to the yonah. It's a type of bird similar to the dove. Can be heard in our land. So it's this time of spring. And actually, I think the Targum in Nach in Aramaic says that Hanitzanim niru ba'aretz is referring to Moshe and Aaron. Actually, that Moshe and Aaron are they sprouted, so to speak. That's it. So it's springtime. Spring. So it's an interesting association. We have spring related to Lech Lecha, which typically takes place in the fall, actually. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Bo ure'eh kama yesh lo la'adam lachshir ma'asav b'fnei boro, lit'asek b'toraso yomam v'layla, shema'alat ha'torah l'mala min kol ha'ma'alot. Rabbi Yehuda says, come and see how much a person needs to make themselves better before their Creator. Make their actions more kosher, so to speak. Make their actions better. Become a better person in how they act in the world, and to work in Torah night and day, because the stature of the Torah is beyond all other things. Beyond all other levels, the Torah is on top of everything, so to speak. It's the highest level of stature. So we see an interesting thing here. There's a lot of things going on in this paragraph. The Torah, right? It's not just intellectual. So before he mentions L'hit'asek b'Torah yomam v'layla, he says L'chshir ma'asav lifnei boro. Right. So the Torah has to first of all relate to, most importantly, how you behave in the world. It's not just intellectual. It's not just something that you learn here. It has to be something which translates into your life.
That's like Torah in Der Charet. I don't remember that Rav Hirsch. It's the same idea that like everything that we do is Torah related. It's not that we do things and we learn Torah.
It's interesting. Yeah, Rav Hirsch is great. That's exactly it. Yeah, that the Torah is it's a picture of the entire person. It's not just I go to the place where I worship God and I'm a good person, or I think about lofty things, and then I go out and I go out and then I'm mean to the next person, or I have business practices which are really, illegal or taking advantage of people. Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly the concept. Another guest. Hey, Jill. Oh, good. Please come. We're just getting into it.
Yeah, either way,
Wherever you like. Fine.
So what's prarashat? Lech Lecha?
Lech Lecha. Yeah. That was just an interesting thing. Thanks for coming. So the concept here is that the Torah is something that informs us that should inform us how to behave in the world. It's not intellectual. I mean, it is intellectual, but it's a type of intellect that relates to who we are and what we're doing in the world, and it should be for the sake of lahakshir masav lifnei boro, to make your actions in the world better and more kosher. I don't know, to make them more fitting and before God. It's like. Oftentimes, there's old Hasidic teaching that you should. The world is an interesting place, and if you find yourself in a mindset that you might make a sin, you should envision your Rebbe standing right next to you with all your might, and then you'll calm down, right? So this is kind of like a similar thing that the Torah should be such that we should always keep God in mind. That wherever we are, it should somehow connect, and that's the Torah touches all aspects of life. It has to do with all sorts of mundane things, partially because the consciousness, the awareness of God, needs to be brought into all these mundane areas. It can't just remain an intellectual aside. It can't just be something interesting and then I go and I behave strangely or I do something. It has to be through and through. And our job, and partially in the world, is to learn how to translate these ideas into reality. As opposed to the conception of Esav in the Midrash is that was his major problem. Esav's major problem was that he had great ideas, but he couldn't translate them into how he acted, how he behaved. Wonderful ideas, and so this is represented in the story that Esav's head is buried in the Marat Machpelah. It's a whole interesting story, I think about Hushim ben Dan, and there's this whole story. Anyway, he died, his head ended up in the Marat Machpelah and his body not. Whether they take it literally or not, I don't know, but it's an amazing idea, meaning the conception of basically, Esav represents like Western civilization. Mm-hmm. So Western civilization has wonderful ideas. There are a lot of really great ideas, a lot of beauty, wonderful theater, wonderful music, great authors. The problem is not in the ideas. The problem is in how does it translate from the ideas into the actual. And so our job as Jews is, again, it's so beautiful how it's stated, Kama yesh lo adam lachshir ma'asav lifnei boro. The first thing is you have to really work on becoming a good person, and it's hard in this world. There's lots of things going on, and how do we accomplish this? By learning Torah, that's the key to translate all the wonderful ideas into reality. Right? That the Torah is really above everything in this way. Now, what's interesting is that also, right, the Torah also has another aspect. And we can talk about these two aspects of Torah. The Torah also has an aspect of, which is how it starts the piece, right? It has an aspect of spring, beauty, right? The birds are singing, right? All the buds are coming out, the flowers are sprouting. It's a very beautiful, meaning there's a development that happens in the Torah. There's a kind of sprouting and an unfurling that happens in our learning, right? So again, it's not necessarily just this kind of pietistic notion where you learn, which is also actually not necessarily a bad thing. You learn in order to improve yourself, and the rabbis have parables and stories and there's halachot as to how we should act, and we do according to those things, and we implement them as much as we can, and we have a community to help us do that. But even more so than that, what he's also saying here is that by delving into Torah, but the Torah of Eita Zamir Higia, the time of singing has come. There's this beautiful kind of unfurling, creative aspect of Torah. That in and of itself, when you touch that level of Torah inside you, then it molds you into who you should be. Right? Which is a servant of God. Which is a very high being. So the Torah, by its very nature, right, as you go more into it and you start to see things, right, again, as we talked about before, that because every person is in a unique place in life, quite both literally and also kind of more metaphorically. As you go and you start to see things that no one else has seen or could see because of who you are and your experience, so then the Torah then really starts to machshir you, starts to open you up into who you're supposed to be, and into a very high and kosher person.
Sorry to be completely egotistical, but last night I had this really restless night. I'm surprised you didn't hear me. She lives across the alley. And I was just restless and waking up, reading a couple songs, and next sleep. And one of the times I woke up at 4 a.m, I heard this voice and it said, Eved Hashem. Now I'm a woman, so it should have said whatever the female is. But it was just like, it was so clear. And so when you're saying servant of God, it's like, okay, this is way familiar to me. I just heard that.
Oh, that's so cool. That's interesting.
That is pretty cool.
That's neat,
Yeah.
Put me to work, show me what I'm supposed to do.
Well, and Eved Hashem, I mean, we'll see where he takes this, but the whole conception, the whole conception of, not the whole, but an aspect of being a Jew is you're serving God, meaning your life has a higher purpose. It's not, it doesn't mean that, but as opposed to your life having a higher purpose and therefore all the details are not as important. That's the opposite. Your life has a higher purpose, and so the details are more meaningful in a certain way. So there seems to be these two aspects of the Torah, but they really work with each other. Again, the concept here is that it's not necessarily like it's not necessarily that the chov of learning Torah constantly is just obviously to be sitting in front of a book, right? The conception is that when you learn from books, when you learn from people, when you learn by yourself, it should kind of almost like activate. It's like almost like a vitamin or something that kind of activates over time, time release capsule that activates you as in your potential as a human being in the world, and your development and your contribution to humanity. In a small or large way, we never know. That's one of the interesting things about life, is that you never know. A small action here could have huge repercussions 100 years from now. And a large action now could have very little repercussions, even though it seems large now. In terms of the development of humanity, one never really knows, and so the interesting part is to be aware of and to kind of activate your own development process and cycle, and to not be afraid of your own unique and creative, beautiful way of understanding life and Torah. So he goes on. Damar Reb Yehuda, train Tavin Ravrin it be'oraita. There are two great things in the Torah: Chaim ve'utra, life and wealth. Dichtiv orach yamim b'mina, v'smola osher v'kavod. Life and wealth. So again, was that old phrase? I think it's an old Moroccan Jewish phrase, right? Einayim, yadayim, shinayim, raglayim. Ashir. Wealth. Right? It spells out the Rosh Hashanah spells out wealth. Right? So life in itself, just to be alive is a wealthy experience if you have those things. But the Torah, the concept here, again, is that the question here is, how wealthy is your life? Where is your wealth? Where do you find that aspect of your life that has a depth to it? You know, and I think the answer here is, again, it's the internal, it's the development of your perspective on life that really has to do with those things that last. I mean, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that your perspective, which is like your consciousness, let's say it goes on forever, just for the sake of argument. So if that's the case, so then the thing to develop is your perspective, is your consciousness, right? Your ability to understand and to see, again, as the good in life, the good things, the good aspect, the positive aspect. That's the thing to develop. And so the Torah is the way by which we learn to view everything in a positive way, but in the ultimate positive way, as having to do with God. There's very amazing stories about the Piaseczner Rebbe Zatzal, and even in some of his teachings. I was so astounded. I learned Eish Kodesh, and he was even able, even in the Warsaw Ghetto, he even said, I mean, I could never say it, because it's just like, but he said, I can hear the voice of God even in my tormentors. So he was on such a level of seeing the good. Right? It didn't mean that he didn't recognize what was going on and how bad it was. Right? It doesn't mean that. But it means that personally he was able to see the good to such a degree that nothing could ever get him from seeing the good. He was always connecting with God. And this is really, again, this gets back to the really Rabbi Akiva and the conception of Rabbi Akiva, and actually Rabbi Nachman interprets it very beautifully, that he was so much one with God, and we talk about God as Hatov, the good, that there was nothing that the Romans could do to him that could take him away from this conception of good. He saw the good in everything, even in his own demise. And again, for me to say this, like, how can you even say such a thing? But it's what happened, and it gives us an insight. We know that he was saying the Shema and smiling, and his soul. So this, and again, the Zohar really is the tradition of Rabbi Akiva. It really comes through Rabbi Shin. We know that the Rabbi Akiva had 5 students, ultimately, that went on and taught, and our whole tradition comes really from that. So that, I think, is a conception here. Here we see something interesting in the Zohar. Anyway, we got a little heavy, but more coffee. Amar Rav Papa, Ilain Tlata Havu. So Rav Papa says, it's kind of interesting because it seems almost like a little argument in the Gemara, and it looks like the Gemara in almost a sense. So Rav Papa says, wait, there's 2, there's 3. Right? There's not 2 aspects of the Torah. It's not Chaim and Osher. You know, there's 3. Amar, which of course is referring to Orech Yamim, Bimina, Bismola, Osher, Vekavod. He says there's Orech Yamim, which is life, there's Osher, which is wealth, and there's Kavod, which is honor.
Is Orech with a chet or a kaf?
Chaf. Chaf, yeah. Yeah, Orech is in like length, yeah. Yeah, instead of...
way of...
Right, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's it's interesting. Or
No, but it's weird because a lot of great rebbes have passed away at a young age, and like Arizal, and they say it was because they were such great people that they fulfilled their purpose. So here it's like the older
Well, it's interesting there.
Doesn't necessarily mean older.
It's interesting. Well, right, it's interesting. Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean older. It could be the length of your life and the depth of your life. All the dimensions you saw in your life. It's not just linear. It could be.
It's a hard.
There is also another concept is that every person has certain allotted number of years, but people, because of their sins, live shorter. So people who are righteous, tzaddikim, they actually live how much they're supposed to live, even if they die young. So those people maybe they lived as long as they had to live, not shorter.
individual.
Yeah.
It's an interesting concept. I mean, in general, I think the inyanim of life and death are pretty much beyond us, and they're supposed to be. We don't really. What do we? I mean, I'm very uncomfortable saying anyone died because of a sin. But then again, but you never know.
You never know. That's the point.
Who knows? But it really makes me uncomfortable. But I will say it's an interesting story, since you mentioned it. Rabbi Nachman, they used to have. They used to have basically out-of-body experiences. The rabbis, all the time. It was like not a big deal for them. Or actually, to begin with, I think it was a big deal, but they got used to it to such a degree that they would go back and forth, or whatever, in and out, or whatever you want to say it, all the time. So Rabbi Nachman, this was really a tradition of the Baal Shem Tov, the tradition of the Zohar, really. If you believe the Baal Shem Tov was, instead of being the founder of Hasidism, was instead just the revealer of this inner Torah, which has to do with learning an inner way of understanding the Zohar, and was hidden for many, many years. I think that's really true. It's clear to me. But anyway, they had this tradition they could go, the Rebbes learned how to go from world to world, or from dimension to dimension, outside their body. And Rabbi Nachman went to the heavenly realm, so to speak, and he saw there's some people sitting around learning. There was a Rebbe, and he was teaching. And he saw that sitting right next to the Rebbe was a boy of, say, 14, 15, and sitting at the far end of the table was an old man of 90. And there were some angels hanging out there too, and he said to one of the angels, he said, that doesn't seem right. Why is this young man sitting closer than And the angels kind of smiled and said, we judge quite differently up here. He says, that young man learned more in his small amount of time than the old man did in his long length of time. So length of time and length of life, as like you said, it has to do with depth of life also. It has to do with the ability to learn. I would say maybe it has to do with what we're learning and our development process. We all have a development process, and the question is, what is the best thing for our development process in terms of our consciousness? Right, and that's not always what we think it is, and it's not always what it appears to be, although sometimes it is. But again, the perspective, I think the perspective of the Zohar, is really, again, the perspective of the neshama, of the soul. We'll see. It gets to that. So is it 2 or 3 here things? Amar le Rabbi Yehuda, kavod bichlal oshehu. Rabbi Yehuda said back to him, no, kavod is included in osher. Honor is included in wealth. The manda itle utra itle ikara. And how's the person zocher to all of this? By means of learning, right? So it's through, again, it's the question. And this is really interesting. The question isn't, we spend a lot of time worrying about, making money and doing things, but really the question is being wealthy or having money, is it going to be good for your development as a soul? Your consciousness, is it going to help your consciousness in some way? And we know, again, Rabbi Nachman brings down that there are certain aspects of Torah that only can come into the world by means of someone who has a perspective of having wealth. Moshe Rabbeinu was